Hi there, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video we're going to be talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Our objectives here are to describe the anatomy of both the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, talk about their role in the endocrine system, and list off some of the hormones that each produce. Alright, we're going to start off with the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is a piece of the brain located in the diencephalon. So its name, hypo, means under, so it is located just inferior to the thalamus. So here's a big thalamus, here's our hypothalamus in blue. The pituitary gland is more inferior here, dangling from this little stalk. So we'll get into a little bit more detail about that gland in just a little bit. One of the hypothalamus' big functions is to integrate the nervous and endocrine system. So it acts a little bit like a switchboard. It is going to receive visceral and somatic sensory input. Okay, so it's taking in messages from your sensory nerves, and it's going to coordinate a response through the autonomic nervous system and endocrine system. All endocrine responses that are coming from the hypothalamus have to pass through the pituitary gland to get where they're going. So not all endocrine responses that are going out to the body have to go through here, but all endocrine responses that begin in the hypothalamus will have to pass through the pituitary gland. So to get to the pituitary gland, here's our hypothalamus again, it's going to have to pass through this little stalk here called the infundibulum. And the infundibulum is connected down to our pituitary gland in two ways. It has a vascular or blood vessel connection to the anterior lobe, so this green lobe in front here, and it has a neural connection made up of neurons down to the posterior lobe that you see in purple right there. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are the beginning of a lot of endocrine signaling pathways. Again, not all of them, but a lot. And these are going to include pathways to the thyroid gland, to the adrenal cortex, the gonads, the liver to stimulate growth hormone, to the uterus, mammary glands, and kidneys. So there are quite a number that are going to be passing through this way. The hypothalamus makes two kind of broad types of hormones. So the first type are called releasing or inhibiting factors, and they're going to communicate down with the anterior pituitary gland. These guys are named because that is exactly what they do. So when you have a releasing factor, that is the hypothalamus telling the anterior pituitary, hey, release more of this hormone. Or alternately, an inhibiting factor will tell it, hey, stop that, release less, inhibit this. The second group then are hormones that are synthesized in the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary gland. So they're made up here, but they have to travel down to get properly released by the posterior pituitary. There are really only two of these that you're going to have to worry about, and that is oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So that is the hypothalamus. Now let's travel down this little infundibulum orange guy here to the pituitary gland. Now, as I was saying before, all endocrine responses from the hypothalamus have to pass through that pituitary gland, and that makes it a sort of master gland that's in charge of telling other endocrine glands how much and how fast to produce their own hormones. It has two lobes, and the two lobes are very different from one another. They're made up of two different types of tissue, and they have two different embryological origins. But because of this now, they both have a very complex but different attachment to the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary here is directly linked here by neurons via this hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. And the anterior pituitary does not have a direct connection up to the hypothalamus. Instead, it is connected by this hypophyseal portal system. Okay, this is a network of blood vessels that connects the anterior pituitary directly up to the hypothalamus. All right, so because of the complexity of these connections, the pituitary gland cannot be transplanted. There's no way to recreate these connections. So let's look a little bit more in depth at each of these lobes. The posterior lobe is made up of neural tissue, so it is also called the neurohypophysis. Hypophysis is always going to be referring to the pituitary gland. It's just a second name for it. All right, so the neurohypophysis is composed largely of some of these neurosecretory neurons here that have their cell bodies located up here in the hypothalamus, and their axons travel down through this hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract to get into the posterior pituitary glands. Okay, hormones that are secreted via this pathway begin their production up here in the hypothalamus, and they have to travel along the axons of these neurosecretory cells through the infundibulum before they are able to be secreted out by the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary, I want you to think of this as a place that hormones are stored and released from, but not a place that synthesizes its own hormones. The first of our two hormones that are secreted from the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. And oxytocin is kind of famously associated with childbirth, so it's what's responsible for producing uterine contractions and also milk ejection from the breast. It's also considered to be kind of a love hormone because it acts as a neurotransmitter in the brain. So remember, I told you there's some overlap between hormones and neurotransmitters, and this is one of those. And acting as a neurotransmitter in the brain, it kind of targets things that make social bonding much smoother and reduce stress, which you might also notice here is also a very good thing to have when you've got a newborn baby, which is a big stress producer in and of itself. All right, so oxytocin is going to begin its life up here in the paraventricular nucleus. It is produced by these neurosecretory cells whose axons are going to travel down through that hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, and it will be secreted into blood vessels that surround the posterior pituitary gland. All right, the second hormone here is antidiuretic hormone, also called ADH or vasopressin. And just like its name says, its job is to increase blood pressure. It's going to tell the kidneys to absorb more water so that your blood volume increases. And then at the same time, it constricts the arterioles so you've got more blood fitting into a smaller space, okay? And that ups the blood pressure. That is going to begin its life up here in the supraoptic nucleus, and again, it's going to travel down the axons of these neurosecretory cells and out through the posterior pituitary gland. Now, the anterior pituitary gland is much different. It's made up of glandular tissue instead of neurons and neurosecretory cells. Because of this, it's also called the adenohypophysis. So adeno just refers to the fact that it is glandular. And not only is it a different tissue type from the posterior pituitary, it has a very different origin as well. So the posterior pituitary begins as part of the brain. It's directly linked up there by neurons. The anterior pituitary starts life as part of the hard palate. And it's this teeny little bit here, part of the hard palate called Rathke's pouch. It gets pinched off during development and ends up wrapping itself around the posterior pituitary there. So being glandular tissue, the anterior lobe can actually synthesize its own hormones instead of just being a conduit from the hypothalamus like the posterior pituitary is. But because it is glandular tissue and not derived from the brain itself, it only has an indirect connection up to the hypothalamus. Okay, and that is this hypophyseal portal system. So a portal system, and this is not the only one we're going to see in this unit, a portal system is a direct connection of blood vessels between two different structures. So in this case, the hypophyseal portal veins are carrying blood from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. All right, So let's walk through the pathway that results from having this sort of indirect connection. So we have our neurosecretory cells up here in the hypothalamus. These are going to secrete releasing or inhibiting factors down their axons to the hypophyseal portal veins, okay? The hormones released here are going to be absorbed into the bloodstream and carried directly down to the anterior pituitary gland. All right, the hormones here are going to tell the anterior pituitary to produce its own hormones, and those will be picked up by the bloodstream here as well and carried off into systemic circulation, so carried out toward the rest of the body. Now, where the posterior pituitary only secreted 2 hormones, the anterior lobe makes and secretes many more. But they still fall into 2 general categories here. So first category is going to be tropic hormones, and these are going to act on other endocrine glands. So these, for example, are going to govern how much hormone is made by the adrenal glands, the thyroid glands, and the gonads. All right. Non-tropic hormones then are what are going to act on other tissues. Okay, they have a wide variety of functions, but some of the big ones that you should be familiar with are growth hormone or human growth hormone, which is sent to the liver, and that is what kind of governs the process of growth throughout childhood and adolescence. Prolactin, which prepares the mammary glands to produce milk, and melanocyte stimulating hormone, which will tell the melanocytes in your skin, which we will learn about a little later, to produce pigment. All right, so that brings us to the end of the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. Thank you for joining me here, and I will see you in the next video.